Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Forest of Memories Library. I am Zru Quincaller, the Guardian, the High Remembrancer, and the Arbiter of the Forest of Memories and this library. And today, we're going to be doing something I'm hoping we're going to be doing for a while. We are going to be doing, reading streams. Some people have said that they think I have a really good voice, and that while I don't know if I can do audiobook stuff, I'd be more than willing to read some of my favorite stories to everyone. And with this in mind, I have recently become a diehard fan of the Richard Sharpe series. And today we're going to be reading the first in the chronology of that series. It's not the first book. It's like, I think, the 15th book in the series. But timeline-wise, it is the first. So before we go anywhere, questions, I'm sure. Who is Richard Sharpe? Richard Sharpe is a character made by Bernard Cornwell, as you can see over there on the left. Now, the thing about Sharpe is that he's most known for being played by Sean Bean in the TV movies Sharpe, which are based off the books. Now, the books and the show are very different. We will watch the show at some point. They do have all the episodes on YouTube, which I think is great. But to give you an idea of what we're in for, Richard Sharpe is scum. Richard Sharpe came from the lowest of the low in Revolutionary era England. He's from Yorkshire. He is as I said, scum. He's not a gentleman. He has manners, but he's not really, he's not a gentleman for the time, shall we say. I like it,
Don't mind me, just using Jeff Bezos' money to make ads not play anymore.
Wait, do I have ads running?
Don't mind me, just using Jeff Bezos' money to make ads not play anymore.
Well, I appreciate it, Joseph, but wait, do I have ads running? I had those turned off. Did they turn themselves on? Shit. I'll have to fix that. Yeah, I don't know why it does that. It's weird. Regardless, yes. So let's break down some other things real quick. Richard Sharpe and Richard Sharpe in the book and Richard Sharpe in the TV series are very different men. In the TV series, it's Sean Bean. We all know what Sean Bean looks like. If you're comparing the two, Sean Bean gets like maybe a 75 or an 80 out of 100. There's a few things missing. For one, Sharpe doesn't have blonde hair, he has black hair. Second, Sharpe has a scarred face, which Sean Bean does not. And, Richard Sharpe is covered in more injuries than you can count. But Bernard Cornwell says he loved Sean Bean's portrayal of Sharpe so much that not only has he basically retroactively changed Sharpe's hair to be blonde, he's also made Sharpe canonically from Yorkshire, so he can have Sean Bean's accent. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Like I said, today in our first ever reading stream, we've done a reading stream before, but this I'm hoping to make a more regular thing. So, Sharpe's Tiger, in which Richard Sharpe avoids Sergeant Obadiah Hawkswill, however, it's different in each book, and endeavors to rescue a British officer from under the nose of the Tippo of Mysore. The Siege of Seringapatam, 1799. So yes, Richard Sharpe is scum. And I like what it says in the books. Richard Sharpe, rogue, outlaw, and hero. The one man you want on your side. And Richard Sharpe, who came from nothing, was fooled into joining the army at the young age of 16, and where this story begins, we're going to be following him in Africa. So, sit back, relax, make yourselves comfy, and let's dive right in, shall we? Oh, and just for fun, I actually do have an audio clip from the show that you can now redeem on my bit section. It's called Major Linux. Now, it doesn't have Sharpe in it.
So, will we be reading the All Guardsmen Party after this book?
Maybe. We'll see. But yes, I do have a new bit redeem called Major Linux. It does not have Sharpe in it, but it is basically one of the memes that came from that old show. So, if you ever want to play that, it's there. But, without further ado, let us begin. Also, I'm sorry if it looks like I'm looking down. I have to read the book. So, let's see. And let's see. Here we go. Chapter 1. It was funny, Richard Sharpe thought, that there was no vultures in England. None that he had seen, anyway. Ugly things they were. Rats with wings. He thought about vultures a lot, and he had a lot of time to think because he was a soldier, a private, and so the army insisted on doing a lot of his thinking for him. The army decided when he woke up, when he slept, when he ate, when he marched, and when he was to sit about doing nothing. And that was what he did most of the time. Nothing. Hurry up and do nothing. That was the army's way of doing things, and he was fed up with it. He was bored and thinking of running. Him and Mary. Run away. Desert. He was thinking about it now, and it was an odd thing to worry about right now because the army was about to give Richard Sharpe his first proper battle. He'd been in one fight, but that was 5 years ago, and it had been a messy, confused business in fog, and no one had wondered why the 33rd Regiment was in Flanders or what they were supposed to be doing there. And in the end, they had done nothing except fire some shots at the mist-shrouded French, and the whole thing had been over almost before young Richard Sharpe had known it had begun. He'd seen a couple of men killed. He remembered Sergeant Hawthorne's death best because the sergeant had been hit by a musket ball that drove a rib clean out of his red coat. There was hardly a drop of blood to be seen, just the white rib sticking out of the faded red cloth. "You could hang your hat on it," Hawthorne had said in a tone of wonder. Then he had sobbed, and after that he had choked up blood and collapsed. Sharpe had gone on loading and firing, and then just as he was beginning to enjoy himself, the battalion had marched away and sailed back to England. Some battle. Now he was in India. Sorry, I said Africa earlier. India. He did not know why he was invading Mysore, and nor did he particularly care. King George III wanted Richard Sharpe to be in India, so in India Richard Sharpe was. But Richard Sharpe had now become bored with the king's service. He was young, and he reckoned life had more to offer than hurrying up and doing nothing. There was money to be made. He was not sure how to make money, except by thieving. But he did know that he was bored, and that he could do better than staying on the bottom of the dung heap. That was where he was, he kept telling himself. The bottom of a dung heap, and everyone knew what was piled on top of a dung heap. Better to run, he told himself. All that was needed to get ahead in the world was a bit of sense and the ability to kick a bastard faster than the bastard could kick you. And Richard Sharpe reckoned he had those talents right enough. Though, where to run in India? Half the natives seemed to be in British pay, and those would turn you in for a handful of 10-piece, and the piece was only worth a farthing, and the other Indians were all fighting against the British, or readying to fight them. And if he ran to them, he would just be forced to serve in their armies. He would fetch more pay in a native army, probably far more than the tuppence a day Sharpe got now after stoppages. But why change one uniform for another? No, he would have to run to some place where the army would never find him. Or else it would be the firing squad on some hot morning. A blast of musket shots, a scrape in the red earth for a grave, and next day the rats with wings would be yanking the guts out of your belly like a bunch of blackbirds tugging worms out of a lawn. That was why he was thinking about vultures. He was thinking that he wanted to run, but that he did not want to feed the vultures. Do not get caught. Rule number 1 in the army, and the only rule that mattered. Because if you got caught, the bastards would flog you to death, or else reorganize your ribs with musket balls. And either way, the vultures got fat. The vultures were always there, sometimes circling on long wings that tilted to the sudden winds of the warm upper air, and sometimes standing hunched on branches. They fed on death, and a marching army gave them a glutton's diet. And now, in this last year of the 18th century, 2 Allied armies were crossing this hot, fertile plain in southern India. One was a British army, and the other belonged to a British ally, the Nizam of Hyderabad, and both armies provided a feast of vulture fodder. Horses died, oxen died, camels died, even 2 of the elephants that had seemed so indestructible had died. And then the people died. The twin armies had a tail 10 times longer than themselves, a great sprawl of camp followers, merchants, herders, whores, wives, and children. And among all of those people, as it did among the armies themselves, the plagues ran riot. Men died with dysentery, or shaking with a fever, or choking on their own vomit. They died struggling for breath, or drenched in sweat, or raving like mad things, or with skins blistered raw. Men, women, children all died, and whether they were buried or burned, it did not matter, because in the end, the vultures fed on them anyway, for there was never enough time nor sufficient timber to make a proper funeral pyre, and so the vultures would rip the half-cooked flesh off the scorched bones, and if the bodies were buried, then no amount of stones heaped on the soil would stop the scavenging beast from digging up the swollen flesh, and the vultures' hooked beaks took what the ravenous teeth left behind. And this hot March day promised food in abundance, as the vultures seemed to sense it. As the early afternoon passed, more and more birds joined the spiraling column of wings that circled above the marching men. They did not flap their wings, but they simply soared in the warm air as they glided, tilted, slid, and waited. Always waited, as if they knew that death's succulence would fill their gullets soon enough. "Ugly bastard birds," Sharpe said. "Just rats with wings." But no one in the 33rd's light company answered him. No one had the breath to answer him. The air was choking from the dust kicked up by the men ahead, so that the rearward ranks stumbled through a warm, gritty mix that parched their throats and stung their eyes. Most of the men were not even aware of the vultures, while others were so weary that they had not even noticed the troop of cavalry that had suddenly appeared a half-mile to the north. The horsemen trotted behind a grove of trees that were bright with red blossom, then accelerated away. Their drawn sabers flashed, reflecting sunlight as they wheeled away from the infantrymen. But then, as inexplicably as they'd hurried and swerved away, they suddenly stopped. Sharpe noticed them. British cavalry they were. The fancy boys come to see how proper soldiers fight. Ahead, from the low rise of land where a second group of horsemen was silhouetted against the furnace whiteness of the sky, a gun fired. The crack of the cannon was immense, a billow of sound that punched hollow and malignant across the plain. The gun's smoke billowed white as the heavy ball thrashed into some bushes, tore leaves and blossoms to tatters, struck dust from the baked ground, and then ran on in ever-decreasing bounces to lodge against a gnarled fallen tree, from which a pale shower of decaying wood spurted. The shot had missed the red-coated infantry by a good 200 paces, but the sound of the cannon woke up the weary. "Jesus!" a voice in the rear file said. "What was that?" "A bleeding camel farted. What the hell do you think it was?" a corporal answered. "I didn't think you had a mother," Private Garrard said. "Everyone's got a mother, Tom." "Not Sergeant Hakesill," Garrard said, then spit a mix of dust and spittle. The column of men had momentarily halted, not because of any orders, but rather because the cannon shot had unnerved the officer leading the front company, who was no longer sure exactly where he was supposed to lead the battalion. "Hakeswills weren't born of a mother," Garrard said vehemently. He took off his shako and used his sleeve to wipe the dust and sweat from his face. The woolen sleeve left a faint trace of red dye on his forehead. "Hakeswill was spawned of the devil," Garrard said, jamming the shako back on his white-powdered hair. Sharpe wondered whether Tom Garrard would run with him. 2 men might survive better than 1. And what about Mary? Would she come? He thought about Mary a lot, when he was not thinking about everything else. Except that Mary was inextricably twisted into everything else. It was confusing. She was Sergeant Bickerstaff's widow, and she was half Indian and half English. And she was 22, which was the same age as Sharpe, or at least he thought it was the same age. It could be that he was 21 or 23. He was not really sure on account of not ever having had a mother to tell him. Of course he did have a mother. Everyone had a mother. But not everyone had a Cat Lane whore for a mother who disappeared just after her son was born. The child had been named for the wealthy patron of the foundling home that had raised him. But the naming had not brought Richard Sharpe any patronage, only brought to him the reeking bottom of the army's dung heap. Still, Sharpe reckoned, he could have a future, and Mary spoke 1 or 2 Indian languages, which could be useful if he and Tom did run. The cavalry off to Sharpe's right spurred into a trot again, and disappeared beyond the red-blossomed trees, leaving only a drifting cloud of dust behind. 2 galloper guns, light 6-pounder cannons, followed them, bouncing dangerously on the uneven ground behind their teams of horses. Every other cannon in the army was drawn by oxen, but the galloper guns had horse teams that were 3 times as fast as the plodding drought cattle. That's all. Oh, hold on. I know that's supposed to be draft, like, working oxen, but it's D-R-A-U-G-H-T. Like, that looks like drought, but that draft, it's draft cattle. It's weird. English is weird. Where was I? Sorry, I lost my spot. There we go. The lone enemy cannon fired again, its brutal sound punching the warm air with an almost palpable impact. Sharpe could see more enemy guns on the ridge, but they were smaller than the gun that had just fired, and Sharpe presumed they did not have the long range of the bigger cannon. Then he saw a trace of gray in the air, a flicker like a vertical pin stroke, drawn against the pale blue sky, and he knew that the big gun's shot must be coming straight towards him, as he knew, too, that there was no wind to carry the heavy ball gently aside, and all that he realized in a second or so, that the ball was in the air, too short of a time to react, only to recognize death's approach. But then the ball slammed into the ground a dozen paces short of him, and bounced on up over his head to run harmlessly into a field of sugarcane. To give context here, Richard Sharpe is 6 feet tall, so if that cannonball bounced over his head, that thing was, you can imagine how close that was. I reckon the bastards have got your mother laying the gun now, Dick, Gerard said. No talking now! Sergeant Hakeswell's voice screeched suddenly. Save your godless breath! Was that you talking, Gerard? Not me, Sarge. Ain't got the breath. You ain't got the breath! Sergeant Hakeswell came hurrying down the company's rank and thrust his face up towards Gerard. You ain't got the breath! That means you're dead, Private Gerard! Dead! No use to king or country if you're dead! But you never was any bleeding use anyway. The sergeant's malevolent eyes flicked to Sharpe. Was it you talking, Sharpie? Not me, Sarge. You ain't got orders to talk. If the king wanted you to have a conversation, I'd have told you so. So says so in the scriptures. Give me a firelock, Sharpie. Quick now. Sharpe handed his musket over to the sergeant. It was Hakeswell's arrival in the company that had persuaded Sharpe that it was time to run away from the army. He'd been bored anyway, but Hakeswell had just added injustice to boredom. Not that Sharpe cared about injustice, for only the rich had justice in the world. But Hakeswell's injustice was touched with such malevolence that there was hardly a man in the light company not ready to rebel. And all that kept them from mutiny was the knowledge that Hakeswell understood their desire, wanted it, and wanted to punish them for it. He was a great man for provoking insolence and then punishing it. He was always 2 steps ahead of you, waiting around a corner with a bludgeon. He was a devil, was Hakeswell. A devil in a smart red coat decorated with sergeant's badges. Yet to look at Hakeswell was to see the perfect soldier. It was true that his oddly lumpy face twitched every few seconds, as though an evil spirit was twisting and jerking just beneath his sun-reddened skin. But his eyes were blue, his hair was powdered as white as the snow that never fell on the ground, and his uniform was as smart as though he stood guard at Windsor Castle. He performed drill like a Prussian, each movement so crisp and clean that it was a pleasure to watch. But then the face would twitch and his oddly childlike eyes would flicker a sideways glance, and you could see the devil peering out. Back when he had been a recruiting sergeant, Hakeswell had taken care not to let the devil show, and that was when Sharpe had first met him. But now, when the sergeant no longer needed to gull and trick young fools into the ranks, Hakeswell did not care who saw his malignancy. Sharpe stood motionless, as the sergeant untied the scrap of rag that Sharpe used to protect his musket's lock from the insidious red dust. Hakeswill peered at the lock, found nothing wrong, then turned away from Sharpe so that the sun could fall full on the weapon. He peered again, cocked the gun, dry-fired it, then seemed to lose interest in the musket as a group of officers spurred their horses toward the head of the stalled column. "Company!" Hakeswill shouted. "Company! Shun!" The men shuffled their feet together and straightened as the three officers galloped past. Hakeswill had stiffened into a grotesque pose, his right boot tucked behind his left, his legs straight, his head and shoulders thrown back, his belly thrust forward and his bent elbows straining to meet in the concavity at the small of his back. None of the other companies of the King's 33rd Regiment had been stood to attention in honor of the passing officers, but Hakeswill's gesture of respect was nevertheless ignored. The neglect had no effect on the sergeant, who, when the trio of officers had gone past, shouted at the company to stand easy, and then peered again at Sharpe's musket. "You'll not find out wrong with it, Sarge," Sharpe said. Hakeswill, still standing at attention, did an elaborate about-turn, his right boot thumping down to the ground. Did I hear me give you permission to speak, Sharpie?" "No, Sarge." "No, Sarge. No, you did not. Flogging offense, that, Sharpie." Hakeswill's right cheek twitched with the involuntary spasm that disfigured his face every few seconds, and the vehement evil of the face was suddenly so intense that the light company momentarily held its breath in expectation of Sharpe's arrest. But then the thumping discharge of the enemy cannon rolled across the countryside, and the heavy ball splashed and bounced and tore its way through a bright green patch of growing rice. And the violence of the harmless missile served to distract Hakeswill, who turned to watch as the ball rolled to a stop. "Poor bloody shooting," Hakeswill said scathingly. "Heathens can't lay guns, I dare say. Or maybe they're toying with us. Toying!" The thought made him laugh. It was not, Sharpe suspected, the anticipation of excitement that had brought Sergeant Obadiah Hakeswill to this state of near joviality, but rather the thought that a battle would cause casualties and misery was the sergeant's delight. He liked to see men cowed and frightened, for that made them biddable, and Sergeant Hakeswill was always at his happiest when he was in control of unhappy men. The three officers had stopped their horses at the head of the column, and now used telescopes to inspect the distant ridge, which was colored by a raging fringe of smoke left from the late discharge of the enemy cannon. "That's our colonel, boys," Hakeswill announced to the 33rd Light Company. "Colonel Arthur Wellesley himself. God bless him for a gentleman, which he is and you ain't. He's come to see you fight, so make sure you do. Fight like the Englishman you are. I'm a Scot." A sour voice spoke from the rear rank. "I heard that! Who said that?" Hakeswill glared at the company, his face twitching uncontrollably. In a less blithe mood, the sergeant would have ferreted out the speaker and punished him. But the excitement of pending battle persuaded him to let the offense pass. "A Scot!" he said derivatively instead. "What is the finest thing a Scotsman ever saw? Answer me that!" No one did. "The high road to England, that's what! Says so in the scriptures, so it must be true." He hefted Sharpe's musket as he looked down the waiting ranks. "I shall be watching you," he snarled. "You ain't none of you been in a proper fight. Not a proper fight before, but on the other side of that bleeding hill, there's a horde of black-faced heathens who can't wait to lay their filthy hands on your women folk. So if so much as one of you turns his back, I'll have the skin off the lot of you. Bare bones and blood, that's what you'll be. But you does your duty and obeys your orders, and you can't go wrong. And who gives the orders?" The sergeant waited for an answer, and eventually Private Mallinson offered one. "The officers, Sergeant. The officers! The officers!" Hakeswill spat his disgust at the answers. "Officers are here to show us what we're fighting for, gentlemen. Gentlemen they are, proper gentlemen. Men of property and breeding, not broken potboys and scarlet-coated pickpockets like what you are. Sergeants give the orders. Sergeants is what the army is. Remember that, lads. You're about to go into battle against heathens, and if you ignore me, you'll be a dead man." Doing his voice hurts my throat, but I hope you get the idea of what kind of a bastard Sergeant Hakeswill is. The face twitched grotesquely. its jaw wrenched suddenly sideways, and Sharpe, watching the sergeant's face, wondered if it was nervousness that had make Hakeswill so voluble. "But keep your eyes on me, lads," Hakeswill went on, "and it'll be right as trivets. And you know why?" He cried the last word out in a dramatic tone as he stalked down the light company's front rank. "You know why?" he asked again, now sounding like some dissenting preacher ranting in a hedgerow. "Because I cannot die, boys! I cannot die!" He was suddenly intense, his voice hoarse and full of fervor as he spoke. It was a speech that all the light company had heard many times before, but it was remarkable for all that. Though Sergeant Green, who was outranked by Hakeswill, turned away in disgust. Hakeswill jeered at Green, then tugged at the tight constriction of the leather stock that circled his neck, pulling it down so that an old dark scar was visible at his throat. "The hangman's noose, boys!" he cried. "That's what marked me there! The hangman's noose! See it? See it! But I am alive, boys! Alive and on 2 feet instead of being buried under the soil! Proof as never was that you needs not die!" His face twitched again as he released the stock. "Marked by God!" he finished, his voice gruff with emotion. "That's what I am! Marked by God!" "Mad as a hare," Tom Garrard muttered. "Did you speak, Sharpie?" Hakeswill whipped around to stare at Sharpe. But Sharpe was so palpably still and staring mutely ahead that his innocence was indisputable. Hakeswill paced back down the light company. "I've watched men die. Better men than any of you pieces of scum. Proper men. But God has spared me. So you do what I say, boys, or else you'll be carrion." He abruptly thrust the musket back into Sharpe's hand. "Clean weapon, Sharpie. Well done, lad." He paced smartly away, and Sharpe, to his surprise, saw the scrap of rag had been neatly retied around the lock. The compliment to Sharpe had astonished all of the light company. "He's in a rare good mood," Garrard said. "I heard that, Private Garrard!" Hakeswill shouted over his shoulder. "Got ears in the back of me head, I have! Silence now! Don't want no heathen horde thinking you're frit! You're white men, remember? Bleached in the cleansing blood of the bleeding lamb! So no bleeding talking in the ranks! Nice and quiet, like them bleeding nuns who never utters a sound on account of having their papist tongues cut out. Are you creeped out yet? Are you disturbed? Are you uncomfortable? Good. Get used to it. This guy's an asshole. I'm sorry to say. I mean, I'm not sorry he's an asshole, but I'm sorry you're going to have to get used to it." He suddenly crashed to attention once again and saluted by bringing his spear-tipped halberd across his body. "Company all present, sir!" he shouted in a voice that must have been audible on the enemy-held ridge. "All present and quiet, sir! Have their backs whipped bloody out, sir!" Lieutenant William Lawford curbed his horse and nodded at Sergeant Hakeswill. Lawford was the light company's second officer, junior to Captain Morris, and senior to the brace of young ensigns. But he was newly arrived in the battalion, and was as frightened of Hakeswill as were the men in the ranks. "The men can talk, Sergeant," Lawford observed mildly. "The other companies aren't silent." "No, sir. Must save their breath, sir. Too bleeding hot to talk, sir. Besides, they got heathens to kill, sir. Mustn't waste breath on chit-chat. Not when they're black-faced heathens to kill, sir. Says so in the scriptures, sir." "If you say so, Sergeant," Lawford said, unwilling to provoke a confrontation. Then he found he had nothing else to say, and so, awkwardly aware of the scrutiny of the light company's 76 men, he stared at the enemy-held ridge. But he was also conscious of having ignominiously surrendered to the will of Sergeant Hakeswill, and so he slowly colored as he gazed toward the west. Lawford was popular, but thought to be weak, though Sharpe was not so sure of that judgment. He thought the lieutenant was still finding his way among the strange and sometimes frightening human currents that made up the 33rd, and that in time Lawford would prove a tough and resilient officer. For now, though, William Lawford was 24 years old and had only recently purchased his lieutenancy, and that made him unsure of his authority. Okay, pause for a minute. I'm sure some of y'all just heard me say that and wonder, wait, he bought his position? Yes. During this time of warfare, at least in the British Empire, if you wanted to be an officer, you had to buy it. Now remember, as an officer, you were also expected to have like certain things. You would need a horse, you would need a better uniform, you need a weapon, you need a telescope, blah, blah, blah. All the stuff you're going to have to buy yourself. So this meant that the really, 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 really rich people ended up getting the higher ranking positions. It was possible to be promoted through merit, but it was extremely rare. And what would end up happening usually is that, let's say you bought your lieutenancy. Well, you want to move up in the ranks? Not only are you going to need money, of course, but you're also going to have to wait for the next person above you, which in this case would be a captain. You got to wait for him. You got to wait for some of them to die, because if there are no open vacancies, you can't get the position. Oh, and one more thing. Even if you get the position, even if you pay for the position, if the higher ups at Horse Guards, which are basically like, it's basically a building in London where they confirm all the military stuff like ranks, pay, blah, blah, blah. If they don't like you, even after you paid for your rank, they can tell you no. They'll give you your money back. Maybe. Probably. Doubtful. But they'll basically say, yeah, no, you don't get that promotion. We don't care. We don't care if there's a position open. We don't care if you paid for it. We don't like you. Therefore, we're not giving you more authority. So back then, being in the army was just as much a game of politics as it was about fighting for king and country. And trust me, the whole thing y'all have always probably heard about how, oh, the officers look down and spit on the lower enlisted men or the drafted men. Yeah, that still exists in this time period too. Even more so in some cases. Ensign Fitzgerald, who was only 18, strolled back from the column's head. He was whistling as he walked and slashing with a drawn saber at tall weeds. "Off in a moment, sir," he called up cheerfully to Lawford, then seemed to become aware of the light company's ominous silence. "Not frightened, are you?" he asked. "Saving the breath, Mr. Fitzgerald, sir," Hakeswill snapped. "They've got breath enough to sing a dozen songs and still beat the enemy," Fitzgerald said scornfully. "Ain't that so, lads?" "We'll beat the bastards, sir," Tom Garrard said. "And let me hear you sing," Fitzgerald demanded. "Can't bear silence. We'll have a quiet time in our tombs, lads, so we might as well make a noise now." Fitzgerald had a fine tenor voice that he used to start the song about the milkmaid and the rector. And by the time the light company had reached the verse that told how the naked rector, blindfolded by his milkmaid and think he was about to have his heart's desire, was being steered toward Bessie the cow, the whole company was bawling the song enthusiastically. They never did reach the end. Captain Morris, the light company's commanding officer, rode back from the head of the battalion and interrupted the singing. "Half companies!" he shouted at Hakeswill. "Half companies it is, sir! At once, sir! Light company! Stop your bleeding noise! You heard the officer!" Hakeswill bellowed at them. "Sergeant Green, take charge of the after ranks. Mr. Fitzgerald, I'll trouble you to take your proper place on the left, sir. Forward ranks! Shoulder firelocks! 20 paces forward! March! Smartly now! Smartly!" Hakeswill's face shuddered as the front 10 ranks of the company marched 20 paces and halted, leaving the other 9 ranks behind. All along the battalion column, the companies were similarly dividing, their drill as crisp as though they were back on the Yorkshire parade ground. A quarter mile off to the 33rd's left, another 6 battalions were going through the same maneuver, and performing it with just as much precision. Those 6 battalions were all native soldiers in the service of the East India Company, though they wore red coats just like the King's men. The 6th Sepoy Battalion shook out their colors, and Sharpe, seeing the bright flags, looked ahead to where the 33rd's 2 great regimental banners were being loosed from their leather tubes to the fierce Indian sun. The first, the King's colors, was a British flag on which the regiment's battle honors were embroidered, while the second was the regimental colors, and had the 33rd's badge displayed on a scarlet field, the same scarlet as the men's jacket facings. The tasseled silk banners blazed, and the sight of them prompted a sudden cannonade from the ridge. Till now there had only been the 1 heavy gun firing, but abruptly 6 other cannons joined the fight. The new guns were smaller, and their round shot fell well short of the 7 battalions. Major Shee, the Irishman who commanded the 33rd, while its colonel, Arthur Wellesley, had control of the whole brigade, cantered his horse back, spoke briefly to Morris, then wheeled away towards the head of the column. We're going to push the bastards off the ridge, Morris shouted at the light company, then bent his head to light a cigar with a tinderbox. Any bastard that turns tail, Sergeant, Morris went on with his cigar was properly alight, will be shot. You hear me? Loud and clear, sir, Hakeswill shouted. Shot, sir! Shot like the coward he is! He turned and scowled at the two half-companies. Shot! And your name's posted in your church porch at home as the coward you are. So fight like Englishmen! Scotsmen! A voice growled behind Sharpe, but too softly for Hakeswill to hear. Irish, another man said. We ain't none of us cowards, Gerard said more loudly. Sergeant Green, a decent man, hushed them. Quiet, lads. I know you'll do your duty. The front of the column was marching now, but the rearmost companies were kept waiting, so that the battalion could advance with wide intervals between its 20 half-companies. Sharpe guessed that the scattered formation was intended to reduce any casualties caused by the enemy's bombardment, which, because it was still being fired at extreme range, was doing no damage. Behind him, a long way behind, the rest of the Allied armies were waiting for the ridge to be cleared. The mass looked like a formidable horde, but Sharpe knew that most of what he saw was the two armies' civilian tail. The chaos of merchants, wives, sutlers, and herdsmen who kept the fighting soldiers alive, and whose supplies would make the siege of the enemy's capital possible. It needed more than 6,000 oxen just to carry the cannonballs for the big siege guns. And all those oxen had to be herded and fed, and the herdsmen all traveled with their families, who, in turn, needed more oxen to carry their own supplies. Lieutenant Lawford had once remarked that the expedition did not look like an army on the march, but like a great migrating tribe. The vast horde of civilians and animals were encircled by a thin crust of red-coated infantry, most of them Indian sepoys, whose job was to protect the merchants, ammunition, and draft animals from the quick-riding, hard-hitting light cavalry of the Tipu Sultan. The Sultan, the enemy, the tyrant of Mysore, and the man who had presumably been directing the gunfire on the ridge. The Tipu ruled Mysore, and he was the enemy, but what he was, or why he was an enemy, or whether he was a tyrant, beast or demigod, Sharpe had no idea. Sharpe was here because he was a soldier, and it was sufficient that he had been told that the Tipu Sultan was his enemy, and so he waited patiently under the Indian sun that was soaking his lean, tall body in sweat. Captain Morris leaned on his saddle's pommel. He took off his cocked hat and wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that had been soaked in cologne water. He had been drunk the previous night, and his stomach was still churning with pain and wind. If the battalion had not been going into battle, he would have galloped away, found a private spot, and voided his bowels, but he could hardly do that now in case his men thought it a sign of weakness, and so he raised his canteen instead and swallowed some arrack in the hope that the harsh spirit would calm the turmoil in his stomach. Now, Sergeant, he called when the company in front had moved sufficiently far ahead. Forward, half company! Hakeswill shouted. Forward march! Smartly now! Lieutenant Lawford, given supervision of the last half company of the battalion, waited until Hakeswill's men had marched 20 paces, then nodded at Sergeant Green. Forward, Sergeant. The redcoats marched with unloaded muskets, for the enemy was still a long way off, and there was no sign of the Tipu Sultan. That's weird. I'm not sure if it's Tipo or Tipo. Again, it's in India, so pronunciations are weird, but bear with me. Might be Tipu, I'm not sure. See, there was no sign of his infantry nor of his feared cavalry. There were only the enemy's guns, and high in the fierce sky the circling vultures. Sharpe was in the leading rank of the final half company, and Lieutenant Lawford, glancing at him, thought once again what a fine-looking man Sharpe was. There was a confidence in Sharpe's thin, sun-darkened face, and hard blue eyes that spoke of an easy competence, and that appearance was a comfort to a young, nervous lieutenant advancing toward his first battle. Sorry, I kept noticing I look like I'm like leaning when I don't mean to. Trying to, let me see why that is. Hold on. There we go. Let's see. With men like Sharpe, Lawford thought, how could they lose? Sharpe was ignorant of the lieutenant's glance, and would have laughed had he been told that his very appearance inspired overconfidence. Sharpe had no conception of how he looked, for he rarely saw a mirror, and when he did, the reflected image meant nothing. Though he did know that the ladies liked him, and that he liked them. He knew, too, that he was the tallest man in the light company, so tall, indeed, that he should have been in the grenadier company that led the battalion's advance. But when he had first joined the regiment, 6 years before, the commanding officer of the light company had insisted on having Sharpe in his ranks. Captain Hughes was dead now, killed by a bowel-loosening flux in Calcutta, but in his time, Hughes had prided himself on having the quickest, smartest men in his company. Men he could trust to fight alone in the skirmish line, and it had been Hughes' tragedy that he had only ever seen his picked men face an enemy once, and that once had been the misbegotten fever-ridden expedition to the Froggy Island off the coast of Flanders, where no amount of quick-wittedness by the men could salvage success from the commanding general's stupidity. Now, 5 years later, on an Indian field, the 33rd again marched toward an enemy, though instead of the enthusiastic and general Captain Hughes, the light company was now commanded by Captain Morris, who did not care how clever or quick his men were, only that they gave him no trouble. Which was why he brought Sergeant Hakeswill into the company, and that was why the tall, good-looking, hard-eyed private called Richard Sharpe was thinking of running. Except he would not run today. Today there would be a fight, and Sharpe was happy at that prospect. A fight meant plunder, what the Indian soldiers called loot, and any man who was thinking of running and striking up life on his own could do with a wee bit of loot to prime the pump. The 7 battalions marched toward the ridge. They were all in columns of half-companies, so that, from a vulture's view, they would have appeared as 140 small scarlet rectangles spread across a square mile of green country as they advanced steadily toward the waiting lines of guns on the enemy-held ridge. The sergeants paced beside the half-companies, while the officers either rode or walked ahead. From a distance, the red squares looked smart, for the men's red coats were bright scarlet and slashed with white crossbelts. But in truth, the troops were filthy and sweating. Their coats were wool, designed for battlefields in Flanders, not in India, and the scarlet dye had run in the heavy rains, so the coats were now a pale pink or a dull purple, and all were stained white with dried sweat. Every man in the 33rd wore a leather stock, a cruel high collar that dug into the flesh of his neck, and each man's long hair had been pulled harshly back, greased with candle wax, then twisted about a small sand-filled leather bag that was secured with a strip of black leather so that the hair hung like a club at the nape of the neck. The hair was then powdered white with flour, and though they clubbed and whitened hair looked smart and neat, it was a haven for lice and fleas. The native sepoys of the East India Company were luckier. They did not cake their hair with white powder, nor did they wear the heavy trouser of the British troops, but instead marched bare-legged. They did not wear the leather stocks either, and even more amazing, there was no flogging in the Indian battalions. An enemy cannonball at last found a target, and Sharpe saw a half-company of the 33rd broken apart as the round shot whipped through the ranks. He thought he glimpsed an instant red mist appear in the air above the formation as the ball slashed through, but maybe that was an illusion. 2 men stayed on the ground as the sergeant closed the ranks up. 2 more men were limping, and one of them staggered, reeled, and finally collapsed. The drummer boys, advancing just behind the unfurled colors, marked the rhythm of the march with steady beats, interspersed with quicker flourishes of. But when the boys marched past the twin heaps of offal that had been soldiers of the Grenadier Company, Well, for a few seconds before, they began to hurry their sticks, and thus quickened the regiment's pace, until Major Shee turned in his saddle and damned their eagerness. "When are we going to load?" Private Mallinson asked Sergeant Green. "When you're told to load, lad. When you're told to. Not before. Oh, sweet Jesus!" This last imprecation from Sergeant Green had been caused by a deafening ripple of gunfire from the ridge. A dozen more of the Tipo's smaller guns had opened fire, and the crest of the ridge was now fogged by a gray-white cloud of smoke. The two British Galloper guns off to the right had unlimbered and started to return fire, but the enemy cannon were hidden by their own smoke, and that thick screen obscured any damage the small Galloper guns might be inflicting. More cavalry trotted to the 33rd's right. These newcomers were Indian troops dressed in scarlet turbans and holding long, wicked-pointed lances. "So what are we bleeding supposed to do?" Mallinson complained. "Just march straight up the bloody ridge with empty muskets?" "If you're told to," Sergeant Green said, "that's what you'll do. Now hold your bloody tongue." "Quiet back there!" Hakeswill called from the half company in front. "This ain't a bleeding parish outing. This is a fight, you bastards!" Sharpe wanted to be ready, and so he untied the rag from his musket's lock and stuffed it into the pocket where he kept the ring Mary had given him. The ring, a plain band of worn silver, had belonged to Sergeant Bickerstaff, Mary's husband, but the sergeant was dead now, and Green had taken Bickerstaff's sergeant stripes and Sharpe his bed. Mary came from Calcutta. That was no place to run, Sharpe thought. The place was full of redcoats. Then he forgot any prospects of deserting, for suddenly the landscape ahead was filled with enemy soldiers. A mass of infantry was crossing from the northern end of the low ridge and marching down onto the plain. Their uniforms were pale purple. They had wide red hats, and like the British Indian troops, were bare-legged. The flags above the marching men were red and yellow, but the wind was so feeble that the flags hung straight down to obscure whatever device they might have shown. More and more men appeared until Sharpe could not even begin to estimate their numbers. 33rd! A voice shouted from somewhere ahead. "Line to the left!" "Line to the left!" Captain Morris echoed the shout. "You heard the officer!" Sergeant Hakeswill bawled. "Line to the left! Smartly now!" "On the double!" Sergeant Green called. The leading half-company of the 33rd had halted, and every other half-company angled to their left and sped their pace.
100, hello, my love,
Hi,
hi
Found.
everyone. Hi, Plav 1 Zaruk, Mile Zaruk, George Zaruk.
Hello, Fountain, and hello, Yoko. And yeah, for those who are coming in or might not know what's going on, yes, we are reading tonight. Thank you for the hydrate. We are reading Sharpe's Tiger, that book over there. Also, before we continue, I'm just going to let everyone know, Amina has told me this, and other people have concurred, that some people like how I talk and think my voice is very relaxing. With that in mind, I'm going to try to keep the volume down a little bit. I'm not going to, it's also straining my throat to shout as Hakeswill, so I'm going to turn it down a bit. If I'm reading too quickly, y'all let me know. If I'm too loud, y'all let me know. Otherwise, y'all just chill and relax as I, think of this as a Zaruk Windcaller audiobook. Let's put it that way. Now, where was I? The leading half-company of the 33rd had halted, and every other half-company angled to their left and sped their pace, with the final half-company, in which Sharpe marched, having the farthest and fastest to go. The men began to jog, their packs and pouches and bayonet scabbards bumping up and down as they stumbled over the small field of crops. Like a swinging door, the column that had been marching directly towards the ridge was now turning itself into a line that would lie parallel to the ridge, and so bar the advance of the enemy infantry. "2 files!" a voice shouted. "2 files!" Captain Morris echoed. "You heard the officer!" Hakeswill shouted. 2 files! On the right! Smartly now!" All the running half-companies now split themselves into 2 smaller units, each of 2 ranks and each aligning itself on the unit to its right, so that the whole battalion formed a fighting line 2 ranks deep. As Sharpe ran into position, he glanced to his right and saw the drummer boys taking their place behind the regiment's colors, which were guarded by a squad of sergeants armed with long, axe-headed poles. The light company was the last into position. There were a few seconds of shuffling as the men glanced right to check their alignment. Then there was stillness and silence, except for the corporals fussily closing up the files. In less than a minute, in a marvelous display of drill, the King's 33rd had deployed from columns of march into one line of battle, so that 700 men, arranged in 2 long ranks, now faced the enemy. "You may load, Major Shee." That was Colonel Wellesley's voice. He galloped his horse close to where Major Shee brooded under the regiment's twin flags. The 6 Indian battalions were still hurrying forward on the left, but the enemy infantry had appeared at the northern end of the ridge, and that meant the 33rd was the nearest unit, and the one most likely to receive the Tipo's assault. "Load!" Captain Morris shouted at Hakeswill. Sharpe felt sudden nervousness as he dropped the musket from his shoulder to hold it across his body. He fumbled with the musket's hammer as he pulled it back to half-cock. Sweat stung his eyes. He could hear the enemy drummers. "Handle cartridge!" Sergeant Hakeswill shouted, and each man of the light company pulled a cartridge from his belt pouch and bit through the tough waxed paper. They held the bullets in their mouths, tasting the sour, salty gunpowder. "Prime!" 76 men trickled a small pinch of powder from the open cartridges into their musket's pan, then closed the lock so the priming was trapped. "Cast about!" Hakeswill called, and the 76 right hands released their musket stocks so that the weapons' butts dropped towards the ground. "And I'm watching you," Hakeswill added. "If any of you lily-white bastards don't use all this powder, I'll skin your hides off you and rub salt on your miserable flesh. Do it proper now." Some old soldiers advised using only half of the powder of a cartridge, letting the rest trickle to the ground so that the musket's brutal kick would be diminished. But faced by an advancing enemy, no man thought of employing that trick this day. They poured the remainder of their cartridges' powder down their musket barrels, stuffed the cartridge paper after the powder, then took the balls from their mouths and pushed them into the muzzles. The enemy infantry was 200 yards away, and advancing steadily to the beat of drums and the blare of trumpets. The Tipo's guns were still firing, but they had turned their barrels away from the 33rd for fear of hitting their own infantry, and were instead aiming at the 6 Indian regiments that were hurrying to close the gap between themselves and the 33rd. "Draw! Ramrod!" Hakeswill shouted, and Sharpe tugged the ramrod free of the 3 brass pipes that held it under the musket's 39-inch barrel. His mouth was salty with a taste of gunpowder. He was still nervous, not because of the enemy, which was trampling ever closer, but because he had a sudden idiotic idea that he might have forgotten how to load a musket. He twisted the ramrod in the air, then placed the ramrod's flared tip into the barrel. "Ram! Cartridge!" Hakeswill snapped. 76 men thrust down, forcing the ball, wadding, and powder charge to the bottom of the barrels. "Return ramrod!" Sharpe tugged the ramrod up, listening to it scrape against the barrel, then twirled it about so that its narrow end would slide down into the brass pipe. He let it drop into place. "Order arms!" Captain Morris called, and the light company, now with loaded muskets, stood to attention, with their guns held against their right sides. The enemy was still too far off for a musket to be either accurate or lethal, and the long, 2-deep line of 700 redcoats would wait until their opening volley would do real damage. "Tallien!" Sergeant Major Bywater's voice called from the center of the line. "Fix! Bayonets!" Sharpe dragged the 17-inch blade from its sheath, which hung behind his right hip. He slotted the blade over the musket's muzzle, then locked it into place by twisting its slot onto the lug. Now, no enemy could pull the bayonet off the musket. Having the blade mounted made reloading the musket far more difficult, but Sharpe guessed that Colonel Wellesley had decided to shoot one volley and then charge. "Going to be a right mucky brawl," Tom Garrard said. "More of them than us," Sharpe responded, staring at the enemy. "The buggers look steady enough." The enemy indeed looked steady. The leading troops had momentarily paused to allow the men behind to catch up, but now, reformed into a solid column, they were readying to advance again. Their ranks and files were ramrod straight. Their officers wore waist sashes and carried highly curved sabers. One of the flags was being waved to and fro, and Sharpe could just make out that it showed a golden sun blazoned against a scarlet sky. Vultures swooped lower. The galloper guns, meanwhile, unable to resist the target of the great column of infantry, poured solid shot into its flank. But the Tippo's men stoically endured the punishment, as their officers made certain that the column was tightly packed and ready to deliver its crushing blow on the waiting redcoat line. Sharpe licked his dry lips. So these, he thought, were the Tippo's men. Fine-looking bastards they were, too. And close enough now that he could see their tunics were not plain pale purple, but were instead cut from a creamy white cloth decorated with mauve tiger stripes. Their crossbelts were black, and their turbans and waist sashes crimson. Heathens they might be, but not to be despised for that, for only 17 years ago, before these same tiger-striped men had torn apart a British army and forced its survivors to surrender. These were the famed tiger troops of Mysore, the warriors of the Tippo Sultan, who had dominated all of southern India until the British thought to climb the Ghats from the coastal plain and plunge into Mysore itself. The French were these men's allies, and some Frenchmen served in the Tippo's forces. But Sharpe could see no white faces in the massive column that was, at last, ready, and to the deep beat of a single drum, lurched ponderously forward. The tiger-striped troops were marching directly towards the king's 33rd and Sharpe. Glancing to his left, he saw that the sepoys of the East India Company regiments were still too far away to offer help. The 33rd would have to deal with the Tippo's column alone. "Private Sharpe!" Hakeswill's sudden scream was loud enough to drown the cheer that the Tippo's men gave as they advanced. "Private Sharpe!" Hakeswill screamed again. He was hurrying along the backs of the light company, and Captain Morris, momentarily dismounted while following him. "Give me a musket, Private Sharpe!" Hakeswill bellowed. "Nothing wrong with it," Sharpe protested. He was in the front rank, and had to turn and push his way between Garrard and Mallinson to hand the gun over. Hakeswill snatched the musket and gleefully presented it to Captain Morris. "See, sir," the sergeant crowed. "Just as I thought, sir. Bastard sold his flint, sir. Sold it to an heathen darky." Hakeswill's face twitched as he gave Sharpe a triumphant glance. The sergeant had unscrewed the musket's dog head, extracted the flint in its folded leather pad, and now offered the scrap of stone to Captain Morris. "Piece of common rock, sir. No good to a man or beast. Must have flogged his flint, sir. Flogged it in exchange for a pagan horse, I dare say, sir. Filthy beast that he is." Moore peered at the flint. "Sell the flint, did you, Private?" But he asked in a voice that mingled derision, pleasure, and bitterness. "No, sir." "Silence!" Hakeswill screamed in Sharpe's face, spattering him with spit. "Lying to an officer. Flogging offense, sir. Flogging offense. Selling his flint, sir. Another flogging offense. Says so in the scriptures." "It is a flogging offense," Morris said with a tone of satisfaction. He was as tall and lean as Sharpe, with fair hair and a fine-boned face that was just beginning to show the ravages of the liqueur which with the captain assuaged his boredom. His eyes betrayed his cynicism, and something much worse, that he despised his men. Hakeswill and Morris, Sharpe thought as he watched them, a right bloody pair. "Nothing wrong with this flint, sir," Sharpe insisted. Morris held the flint in the palm of his right hand. "Looks like a chip of stone to me." "Common grit, sir. Common bloody grit, sir. No good to a man or beast," Hakeswill said. "Might I?" A new voice spoke. Lieutenant William Lawford had dismounted to join Morris, and now, without waiting for his captain's permission, reached over and took the flint from Morris's hand. Lawford was blushing again, astonished by his own temerity in this intervening. "There's an easy way to check, sir," Lawford said nervously. Then he drew out his pistol, cocked it, and struck the loose flint against the pistol's steel. Even in the day's bright sunlight, there was an obvious spark. "Seems like a good flint to me, sir." Lawford said mildly. Ensign Fitzgerald, standing behind Lawford, gave Sharpe a conspiratorial grin. A perfectly good flint, Lawford insisted less definitely. Morris gave Hakeswill a furious look, then turned on his heel and strode back to his horse. Lawford tossed the flint to Sharpe. "Make your gun ready, Sharpe," he said. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Lawford and Fitzgerald walked away as Hakeswill, humiliated, thrust the musket back at Sharpe. "Clever bastard, Sharpie, aren't you?" "I'll have the leather as well, Sergeant," Sharpe said, and once he had the flint seating back, he called after Hakeswill, who had begun to walk away. "Sergeant!" He turned back. You want this, Sergeant?" Sharpe called. He took a chip of stone out of his pocket. He had found it when he had untied the rag from the musket's lock, and realized that Hakeswill had substituted the stone for the flint, which he had pretended to inspect Sharpe's musket with. "No use to me, Sergeant," Sharpe said. "Here." He tossed the stone at Hakeswill, who ignored it. Instead, the sergeant spat and turned away. "Thanks, Tom," Sharpe said, for it had been Gerard who had supplied him with a spare flint. "Worth being in the army to see that," Gerard said, and all around him men laughed to have seen Hakeswill and Morris defeated. "Eyes to your front, lads," Ensign Fitzgerald called. The Irish ensign was the youngest officer in the company, but he had the confidence of a much older man. "Got some shooting to do." Sharpe pushed back into his file. He brought up the musket, folded the leather over the flint, and seated it into the dog's head. Then looked up to see the mass of the enemy was now just 100 paces away. They were shouting rhythmically and pausing occasionally to let a trumpet sound or a drum flourish a ripple. But the loudest sound was the beat of their feet on the ground. Sharpe tried to count the column's front rank, but he kept losing count as enemy officers marched slantwise across the column's face. There had to be thousands of them, thousands of these tiger troops, all marching like a great sledgehammer to shatter the too-deep line of redcoats. "Cutting it fine, aren't we?" a man complained. "Wait, lads, wait," Sergeant Greed said calmly. The enemy now filled the landscape ahead. They came in column form of 60 ranks of 50 men, 3,000 in all. Though to Sharpe's inexperienced eye, it seems as if there must be 10 times that number. None of the Tipo's men fired as they advanced, but they held their fire, just as the 33rd were holding theirs. The enemy's muskets were tipped with bayonets, while their officers were holding deeply curved sabers. On they came, and to Sharpe, who was watching the column from the left of the line, so that he could see its flank as well as its leading file, the enemy formation seemed as unstoppable as a heavily loaded farm wagon that was rolling slowly and inexorably towards a flimsy fence. He could see their faces now. They were dark, with black mustaches and oddly white teeth. The tiger men were close, so close, and their chanting began to dissolve into individual war shouts. Any second now, Sharpe thought, and the heavy column would break into a run and charge with leveled bayonets. 33rd? Colonel Leslie's voice called out sharply from beneath the regiment's colors. "Make ready!" Sharpe put his right foot behind his left so that his body half turned to the right. Then he brought his musket to hip height and pulled the hammer back to full cock. It clicked solidly into place, and somehow the pent-up pressure of the gun's mainspring was reassuring. To the approaching enemy, it seemed as though the whole British line had half turned, and then the sudden movement coming from men who'd been waiting so silently momentarily checked their eagerness. These men weren't human. Above the tiger troops of Mysore, beneath a bunch of flags on the ridge where the guns fired, a group of horsemen watched the column. Was the Tipo here himself? Sharpe wondered. And was the Tipo dreaming of that far-off day when he had broken 3,500 British and Indian troops and marched them off to captivity in his capital at Seringapatam? Yeah, it's a hard word. Seringapatam. The cheers of the attackers were filling the sky now, but still, Colonel Wellesley's voice was audible over the turmoil. Present! 700 muskets came up to 700 shoulders. The muskets were tipped with steel. 700 muskets aimed at the head of the column and about to blast 700 ounces of lead at the leading ranks of that fast-moving, confident mass that was plunging straight toward the pair of British colors under which Colonel Arthur Wellesley waited. The Tiger men were hurrying now, their front rank breaking apart as they began running. The wagon was about to hit the fence. Arthur Wellesley had waited 6 years for this moment. He was 29 years old and had begun to fear that he would never see battle. But now, at last, he would discover whether he and his regiment could fight. And so he filled his lungs to give the order that would start the slaughter. Now, before we continue, something I should point out about Mr. Cornwell's writing style. Like a lot of authors, Cornwell does this thing where every so often you will get this gap in paragraphs, and you'll jump to someone else's perspective. Now, for me, I've always been more of a fan when it comes to writing that if you're going to jump to another perspective, you should tell us whose perspective. Maybe do a thing that says POV person or something like that. Because if you don't do that, it can confuse people, or worse, take them out of the action. So, we will continue. Colonel Jean Goudin sighed. Then, for the 1,000th time in the last hour, he fanned his face to drive away the flies. He, liked India, but he hated the flies, which made India quite hard to like. But on balance, despite the flies, he did like India. Not nearly as much as he loved his native Provence, but where on earth was as lovely as Provence? Your Majesty, he ventured diffidently, then waited as his interpreter struggled to gain the Tipo's attention. The interpreter was exchanging Goudin's French for the Tipo's Persian tongue. The Tipo did understand some French, and he spoke the local Canarese language well enough, but he preferred Persian, for it reminded him that his lineage went back to the great Persian dynasties. The Tipo was ever mindful that he was superior to the darker-skinned natives of Mysore. He was a Muslim, he was a Persian, and he was a ruler, while they were mostly Hindu, and all of them, whether rich, poor, great, or lowly, were his obedient servants. Your Majesty, Colonel Goudin tried again. Colonel, the Tipo was a short man, inclined to plumpness, with a mustache face, wide eyes, and a prominent nose. He was not an impressive-looking man, for certain, but Goudin knew that the Tipo's unprepossessing appearance disguised a decisive mind and a brave heart. Although the Tipo acknowledged Goudin, he did not turn to look at the colonel. Instead, he leaned forward in his saddle with one hand clasped over the tiger hilt of his curved saber, as he watched his infantry march on the infidel British. The sword was slung on a silken sash that crossed the pale yellow silk jacket that the Tipo wore above chintz trousers. His turban was of red silk, and pinned with a gold badge showing a tiger's mask. The Tipo's every possible accoutrement was decorated with a tiger, for the tiger was his mascot and inspiration. But the badge on his turban also incorporated his reverence for Allah, for the tiger's snarling face was formed by a cunning cipher that spelled out a verse of the Quran, "The line of God is the conqueror." Above it, pinned to the turban's brief white plume and brilliant in the day's sunlight, there glittered a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg. Colonel, the Tipo said again. It might be wise, Your Majesty, Goudin suggested hesitantly, if we advanced cannon and cavalry onto the British flank. Goudin gestured to where the 33rd waited in its thin red line to receive the charge of the Tipo's column. If the Tipo threatened a flank of that fragile line with cavalry, then the British regiment would be forced to shrink into square, and thus deny 3/4 of their muskets a chance to fire at the column. The Tipo shook his head. We shall sweep that scum away with our infantry, Goudin, then send the cavalry against the baggage. He let go of his sword's hilt to touch his fingers fleetingly together. Please, Allah. And if it does not please Allah? Gudin asked, and suspected that his interpreter would change the insolence of the question into something more acceptable to the Tipo. Then we shall fight them from the walls of Seringapatam, the Tipo answered, and turned briefly from watching the imminent battle to offer Colonel Gudin a quick smile. It was not a friendly smile, but a feral grimace of anticipation. We shall destroy them with cannon, Colonel, the Tipo continued with relish, and shatter them with rockets. And in a few weeks the monsoon will drown their survivors, and after that, if Allah pleases, we shall hunt fugitive Englishmen from here to the sea. If Allah pleases, Gudin said resignedly. Officially, he was an advisor to the Tipo, sent by the Directorate in Paris to help Mysore defeat the British. And the patient Gudin had just done his best to give advice, and it was none of his fault if the advice was spurned. He brushed the flies from his face and then watched as the 33rd brought their muskets to their shoulders. When those muskets flamed, the Frenchman thought, the front of the Tipo's column would crumble like a honeycomb hit by a hammer. But at least the slaughter would teach the Tipo that battles could not be won against disciplined troops unless every weapon was used against them. Cavalry to force them to bunch up into protection, then artillery and infantry to pour fire into their massed ranks. The Tipo surely knew that, yet he had insisted on throwing his 3,000 infantry forward without cavalry support, and Gudin could only suppose that either the Tipo believed Allah would be fighting on his side this afternoon, or else he was so consumed by his famous victory over the British 17 years before that he believed he could always beat them in open conflict. Gudin slapped at the flies again. It was time, he thought, to go home. Much as he liked India, he felt frustrated. He suspected that the government in Paris had forgotten about his existence, and he was keenly aware that the Tipo was not receptive to his advice. He did not blame the Tipo. Paris had made so many promises, but no French army had come to fight for Mysore, and Gudin sensed the Tipo's disappointment and even sympathized with it. While Gudin himself felt useless and abandoned. Some of his contemporaries were already generals. Even little Bonaparte, a Corsican whom Gudin had known slightly in Toulon, now had an army of his own, while Jean Gudin was stranded in distant Mysore, which made victory all the more important. And if the British were not broken here, then they would have to be beaten by the massed artillery and rockets that waited on Seringapatam's walls. That was also where Gudin's small battalion of European soldiers were waiting. And Seringapatam, he suspected, was where this campaign would be decided. And if there was victory, and if the British were thrown out of southern India, then Gudin's reward would surely be back in France, back home where the flies did not swarm like mice. The enemy regiment waited with leveled muskets. The Tipo's men charged and cheered as they ran impetuously onward. The Tipo leaned forward, unconsciously biting his lower lip as he waited for the impact. Gudin wondered whether his woman in Seringapatam would like Provence, or whether Provence would like her. Or maybe it was time for a new woman. He sighed. He slapped at the flies, and then involuntarily shuddered. For beneath him, the killing had begun. Fire! Colonel Wellesley shouted. 700 men pulled their triggers, and 700 flints snapped forward onto frizens. The sparks ignited the powder in the pans. There was a pause as the fire fizzed through the 700 touch holes, and then an almighty crackling roar as the heavy muskets flamed. The brass butt of the gun slammed into Sharpe's shoulder. He'd aimed the weapon at a sashed officer leading the enemy column. Though even at 60 yards range, it was hardly worth aiming a musket, for it was a frighteningly inaccurate weapon. But unless the ball flew high, it ought to hit someone. He could not tell what damage the volley had caused, for the instant the musket banged into his shoulder, his vision was obscured by the filthy bank of rolling smoke coughed out of the 700 muzzles. He could hardly hear anything either, for the sound of the rear-rank muskets going off close beside his head had left his ears ringing. His right hand automatically went to find a new cartridge from his pouch, but then, above the ringing in his ears, he heard the colonel's brisk voice. "Forward, 33rd! Forward!" "Go on, boys," Sergeant Green called. "Steady now. Don't run. Walk." "Damn your eagerness," Ensign Fitzgerald shouted at the company. "Hold your ranks. This ain't a race." The regiment marched into the musket smoke, which stank like rotten eggs. Lieutenant Lawford suddenly remembered to draw his sword. He could see nothing beyond the smoke, but imagined a terrible enemy waiting with raised muskets. He touched the pocket of his coat in which he kept the Bible given to him by his mother. The front rank advanced closer, through the fog, and suddenly there was nothing ahead but chaos and carnage. The 700 lead balls had converged on the front of the column to strike home with a brutal efficiency. Where there had been orderly ranks, there were now only dead men, and dying men who writhed on the ground. The rearward ranks of the enemy could not advance over the barrier of the dead and the injured, so they stood uncertainly, as out of the smoke the 700 bayonets appeared. On the double! On the double! Don't let them stand!" Colonel Wellesley called. "Give them a cheer, boys," Sergeant Green called. "Go for them now! Kill the buggers!" Sharpe had no thought of deserting now, for now he was about to fight. If there was any one good reason to join the army, it was to fight. Not to hurry up and do nothing, but to fight the king's enemies. And this enemy had been shocked by the awful violence of the close-range volley, and now they stared in horror as the redcoats screamed and ran toward them. The 33rd, released from the tight disciplines of their ranks, charged eagerly. There was loot ahead, loot and food and stunned men to slaughter, and there were few men in the 33rd who did not like a good fight. Not many had joined the ranks out of patriotism. Instead, like Sharpe, they had been forced into uniform after taking the king's shilling because of hunger or desperation, but they were still good soldiers. They came from the gutters of Britain, where a man survived by savagery rather than by cleverness. They were brawlers and bastards, alley fighters with nothing to lose but tuppence a day, or as the good future Duke of Wellington would call them later, the scum of the earth. And that's not me reading the book. That is literally what the Duke of Wellington called his army, not only in India, but also in Spain and Portugal. He called them the scum of the earth. Oh, yeah, and for those who don't know, maybe you don't know your history, Colonel Arthur Wellesley, that's the future Duke of Wellington. It's 1799 by the time of this story. In 16 years, he'll be kicking Napoleon's ass at Waterloo. So keep an eye on that guy. Oh, that reminds me. Just let the imp get a little angry here. If any of you are aware of that Napoleon movie that came out recently with Joaquin Phoenix as Napoleon, don't watch that shit. Do not watch that shit. It is so awful. It is so historically inaccurate. It is disgusting. I caught an hour of it, and I was so disgusted that I was like, yeah, no, I want my money back. This shit. So, yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. Anyway, while I'm giving my throat a minute, see, I want to actually show y'all something. See if I can get it real quick. Let me see. What can I use here? Yeah, that'll work. No, it doesn't. Telling it doesn't. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to show y'all this. For this, we're actually going to switch over to my other screen real quick so y'all can see this. Hold on a moment. Let's see. Put my thing up here. We're going to jump over here. All right. So, recalling what you just heard me read in the book, here is, I mean, it's smaller, but if you've ever wanted to see what a musket line looked like, here's a good example.
The fleet will eventually wear down in my next
Now imagine 700 of those firing at you, and I think you get the idea. Just to prove a point again, remember, 700.
Wear down in my next
Yeah, no thanks. I'm not walking in front of that. Ever. Now then. Also, I apologize if anyone was like chilling or almost asleep and you just got woken up by a volley of muskets. I apologize. But y'all know me by now. I'm a little extra when it comes to historical stuff. It's just what I do. Yeah, y'all can have a little bit extra as a treat. Jaruk is looking out for you, you know. Don't you worry none about it. Let's see. Where were we? Ah, here we go. Sharpe howled as he ran. Oh, yeah, the knock gun? Yeah, they're in this. A Gatling knock gun. Let's not think about that. That sounds utterly terrifying. And I mean, technically, if you want to be picky, a Gatling knock gun is called a Hellblaster volley gun. It's from Warhammer Fantasy. That's basically a Hellblaster volley gun. Anyway. Where did I leave off? Ah, here it is. Sharpe howled as he ran. The sepoy battalions were closing up on the left, but there was no need for their musketry now, for the Tipo's vaunted Tiger infantry were not staying to contest the afternoon. They were edging backwards, looking for escape, and then, out of the north, where they had been half hidden by the red blossom trees, the British and Indian cavalry charged to the sound of a trumpet call. Lances were lowered and sabers held like spears as the horsemen thundered onto the enemy's flank. The Tipo's infantry fled. A few, the lucky few, scrambled back up the ridge, but most were caught in the open ground between the 33rd and the ridge's slope. And there the killing became a massacre. Sharpe reached the pile of dead and leapt over them. Just beyond the bloody pile, a wounded man tried to bring up his musket, but Sharpe slammed the butt of his gun onto the man's head and kicked the musket out of his enfeebled hands and ran on. He was aiming for an officer, a brave man who had tried to rally his troops, and who now hesitated fatally. The man was carrying a drawn saber. Then he remembered the pistol in his belt and fumbled to draw it. But he saw he was too late and turned to run after his men. Sharpe was faster. He rammed his bayonet forward and struck the Indian officer on the side of the neck. The man turned, his saber whistling as he sliced the curved blade at Sharpe's head. Sharpe parried the blow with the barrel of his musket. A sliver of wood was slashed off the stock as Sharpe kicked the officer between the legs. Sharpe was screaming a challenge, a scream of hate that had nothing to do with Mysore or the enemy officer, and everything to do with the frustrations of life. The Indian staggered, hunched over, and Sharpe slammed the musket's heavy butt into the dark face. The officer went down, his saber falling from his hand. He shouted something, maybe offering surrender. Sharpe did not care. He just put his left foot on the man's sword arm and then drove the bayonet hard down into his throat. The fight might have lasted 3 seconds. Sharpe advanced no further. Other men ran past, screaming as they pursued the fleeing enemy. But Sharpe had found his victim. He had thrust the bayonet so hard that the blade had gone clean through the officer's neck and into the soil beneath, and it was hard to work to pull the steel free. And in the end, he had to put a boot on the dying man's forehead before he could tug the bayonet out. Blood gushed from the wound, and then subsided to a throbbing pulse of spilling red as Sharpe knelt and began rifling the man's gaudy uniform, oblivious to the choking, bubbling sound that the officer was making as he died. Sharpe ripped off the yellow silk sash and tossed it aside, together with the silver-hilted saber and the pistol. The saber's scabbard was made of boiled leather, nothing of any value to Sharpe. But behind it was a small embroidered pouch, and Sharpe drew out his knife, unfolded the blade, and slashed through the pouch's straps. He fumbled the pouch open to find that it was filled with nothing but dry rice and one small scrap of what looked like cake. He smelt it gingerly and guessed it was made of some kind of bean. He tossed the food aside and spat a curse at the dying man. "Where's your bleeding money?" The man gasped, making a choking sound, then his whole body jerked as his heart finally gave up the struggle. Sharpe tore at the tunic that was decorated with mauve tiger stripes. He felt the seams, looking for coins, found none, so he pulled off the wide red turban that was sticky with blood. The dead man's face was already crawling with flies. Sharpe pulled the turban apart, and there, in the very center of the greasy cloth, he found 3 silver and a dozen small copper coins. "Knew you'd have something," he told the dead man, and then pushed the coins into his own pouch. The cavalry was finishing off the remnants of the Tipo army. The Tipo himself, with his entourage and standard bearers, had gone from the top of the ridge, and there was no cannon firing there either. The enemy had slipped away, abandoning their trapped infantry to the sabers and lances of the British and Indian cavalry. The Indian cavalry had been recruited from the city of Madras and the East Coast states, which had all suffered from the Tipo's raids, and now they took their bloody revenge, whooping and laughing as their blades cut down the terrified fugitives. Some cavalrymen, running out of targets, were already dismounted and searching the dead for plunder. The sepoy infantry, too late to join the killing, arrived to join the plunder. Sharpe twisted the bayonet off his musket, wiped it clean on the dead man's sash, scooped up the saber and pistol, and then went to find more loot. He was grinning and thinking that there was nothing to this fighting business. Nothing at all. A few shots in Flanders, one volley here, and neither fight was worthy of a named battle. Flanders had been a muddle, and this fight had been as easy as slaughtering sheep. No wonder Sergeant Hakeswill would live forever, as so would he, Sharpe reckoned, because there was nothing to this business. Just a couple of bangs and it was all over. He laughed, slid the bayonet in its sheath, and knelt beside another dead man. There was work to do and a future to finance. If only he could decide where and when it would be safe to run away. All right. That's chapter 1, by the way. So let's address something. Because I know some people are thinking it. Some people are probably thinking, hey, Zaruk, this Sharpe guy doesn't sound like much of a good guy. Yeah, I'm glad you're realizing that. He's not. Richard Sharpe is not a good man. Richard Sharpe is, like I said at the beginning, outsider, rogue, and hero. The one man you want on your side. So, here's the thing. This is actually one of the things that the series, which good old Sean Bean was in, that's him as Sharpe, by the way, if y'all don't know. Here's the thing. That's one thing the movie series got wrong. Sharpe is not a good, he's got morals, but in the book, he's a very gray character, shall we say. In the show, he's more of a hero type. I mean, he still has his vices and everything, but he's still a good guy. But in the books, again, more morally gray, if anything. But I think that's what makes him so interesting. Because here's the thing, you imagine most morally gray people, are like, they're usually shitholes or ass or, anything. Not Sharpe. Sharpe, for example, this is an era where, let's say grape is allowed in military stuff. It's not uncommon for men to take women hostage and do unspeakable things. Not Sharpe. Sharpe is a gentleman in that regard. Sharpe will never do that to a woman. Sharpe, in all the books, Sharpe never does that to a woman. Ever. Hell, Sharpe actually, and I don't know if we'll ever get to this book because it's way down the line, but for example, when Sharpe later on finds a guy who was trying to assault a woman, he takes that guy and the guy who was helping him do it, puts him up against the wall and has him shot by a firing squad. He doesn't give him a trial. He doesn't do anything. He's just like, oh no, you're monsters. You're animals. Okay, then you die like animals. Firing squad. And he shoots them dead right in front of their comrades so they can see it. Like, so the thing is, Richard Sharpe is kind of like the guy you want to, like, you know, there's parts of you where you're like, yeah, I'd probably do the same thing in his shoes. But then there's other stuff where you're like, okay, I don't think I'd do that though. So yeah, that's why I'll admit it's why I really love Mr. Sharpe. He's a really cool character. All right. So I don't think I said it at the beginning of the stream. Reading streams are always going to be shorter. So we've got about another 15 minutes, I'd say. So let's see if we can at least get 50 pages done. Let's see. Chapter 2. Sergeant Obadiah Hakeswill glanced about to see what his men were doing. Just about all of them were plundering, and quite right, too. That was a soldier's privilege. Fight the battle, then strip the enemy of anything worth a penny. The officers were not looting, but officers never did. At least not so that anyone noticed them. But Hakeswill did see that Ensign Fitzgerald had somehow managed to get himself a jeweled saber that he was now flashing around like a shilling whore giving a guinea fan. Mr. Bloody Ensign Fitzgerald was getting above him, in Sergeant Hakeswill's considered opinion. Ensigns were the lowest of the low. Apprentice officers, lads in silver lace, and Mr. Bloody Fitzgerald had no business countermanding Hakeswill's orders, so Mr. Bloody Fitzgerald must be taught his place. But the trouble was that Mr. Fitzgerald was Irish, and Hakeswill was of the opinion that the Irish were only half civilized and never did understand their place. Most of them, anyway. Major Shee was Irish, and he was civilized, at least when he was sober, and Colonel Wellesley, who was from Dublin, was wholly civilized, but the colonel had possessed the sense to make himself more English than the English, while Mr. Bloody Fitzgerald made no pretense about his birth. See this, Hakeswill? Fitzgerald, sublimely unaware of Hakeswill's glowering thoughts, stepped across a body to show off his new saber. See what, sir? Damn blade is made in Birmingham. Will you credit that? Birmingham says so on the blade. Made in Birmingham. Hakeswill dutifully examined the legend on the blade, then fingered the saber's pommel, which was elegantly set with a ring of 7 small rubies. Looks like glass to me, sir, he said dismissively, hoping he could somehow persuade Fitzgerald to relinquish the blade. Nonsense, Fitzgerald said cheerfully. Best rubies. Bit small, maybe, but I doubt the ladies will mind that. 7 pieces of glitter? That adds up to a week of sin, Sergeant. It was worth killing the rascal for that. If you did kill him, Hakeswill thought sourly as he stumped away from the exuberant ensign. More like picked it up off the ground, and Fitzgerald was right. 7 rubies, even small ones, would buy a lot of Naig's ladies. Nasty Naig was a merchant from Madras, one of the many traveling with the army, and he had brought his brothel with him. It was an expensive brothel, officers only, or at least only those who could pay an officer's price. And that made Hakeswill think of Mary Bickerstaff. Miss Mary Bickerstaff. She was a half and half Indian and half British, and that made her valuable. Very valuable. Most of the women who followed the army were dark as Hades, and while Obadiah Hakeswill had no distaste for dark skin, he did miss the touch of white flesh. Okay, look, alright. So, I know if you're listening to this, you might think, this is uncomfortable. I know. Cornwell himself has said that he is aware that, this can come off as a little uncomfortable, but you got to understand, this is from Hakeswill's POV. This is from his mind. And Obadiah Hakeswill is fucked up. So, I apologize in advance if this makes people uncomfortable, but don't worry, as soon as we switch POV again, we won't have to listen to Hakeswill's creepy inner monologues. Let's see. So did many of the officers, and there was a guinea or two to be made out of the lust. Naig would pay well for a skin as pale as Mary Bickerstaff's. She was a rare beauty, Mary Bickerstaff. a beauty amongst a pack of ugly, rancid women. Hakeswill watched as a group of the battalion's wives ran to take part in the plundering, and almost shuddered as he contemplated their ugliness. About 2/3 of the wives were BBs, Indians, and most of those, Hakeswill knew, were not properly married with the colonel's permission, while the rest were those lucky British women who had won the brutal lottery that had taken place on the night before the battalion had sailed from England. The wives had been gathered in a barrack room. Their names had been put in 10 shakoes, one for each company. And the first 10 names drawn from each hat were allowed to accompany their husbands. The rest had to stay in Britain, and what happened to them was anybody's guess. Most went on the parish, but parishes resented feeding soldiers' wives, so as like as not, they were forced to become whores. Barrack gate whores, for the most part, because they lacked the looks for anything better. But a precious few, were pretty, and none were prettier than Sergeant Bickerstaff's half-and-half widow. The women spread out amongst the dead and dying Missourians. If anything, they were even more efficient than their men at plundering the dead, for the men tended to hurry, and so missed the hiding places where a soldier secreted his money. Hakeswill watched Flora Plackett strip the body of a tall tiger-striped corpse, whose throat had been slashed to the backbone by the slice of a cavalryman's saber. She did not rush her work, but instead searched carefully, garment by garment, then handed each piece of clothing to one of her 2 children to fold and stack. Hakeswill approved of Flora Plackett, for she was a large and steady woman who kept her man in good order and made no fuss about a campaign's discomforts. She was a good mother, too, and that was why Obadiah did not care that Flora Plackett was as ugly as a haversack. Mothers were sacred. Mothers were not expected to be pretty. Mothers were Obadiah Hakeswill's guardian angels, and Flora Plackett reminded Obadiah of his own mother, who was the only person in all his life who had shown him kindness. Here we go. Biddy Hakeswill was long dead now. She had died a year before the 12-year-old Obadiah had dangled on a scaffold for the trumped-up charge of sheep stealing. And, to amuse the crowd, the executioner had not let any of the day's victims drop from the gallows, but had instead hoisted them gently into the air so that they slowly choked as their legs jerked in the death dance of the gibbet. No one had taken much notice of the small boy at the scaffold's end, and when the heavens had opened and the rain came down in bucketfuls to scatter the crowd, no one had bothered when Biddy Hakeswill's brother had cut the boy down and set him loose. "Do it for your mother," his uncle had snarled. "God rest her soul. Now be off with you, and don't ever show your face in the dale again." Hakeswill had run south, joined the army as a drummer boy, had risen to sergeant, and had never forgotten his dying mother's words. "No one will ever get rid of Obadiah," she had said. "Not my Obadiah. Death's too good for him." The gallows had proved that. Touched by God, he was. Indestructible. A groan sounded near Hakeswill, and the sergeant snapped out of his reverie to see a tiger-striped Indian struggling to turn onto his belly. Hakeswill scurried over, forced the man onto his back again, and placed its halberd spear point at the man's throat. "Money?" he snarled, then held out his left hand and motioned the counting of coins. "Money!" The man blinked slowly, and then said something in his own language. "I'll let you live, you bugger," Hakeswill promised, leering at the wounded man. "Not that you'll live long. Got a ghoulie in your belly, see?" He pointed at the wound in the man's belly where the bullet had driven home. "Now where's your money? Money! Pise, Don, pagodas, annas, rupees." The man must have understood, for his hand fluttered weakly towards his chest. "Good boy now," Hakeswill said, smiling again. Then his face jerked in its involuntary spasms as he pushed the spear point home, but not too quickly, for he liked to see the realization of death on a man's face. "You stupid bugger, too," Hakeswill said when the man's death throes had ended. And he cut open the tunic and found that the man had strapped some coins to his chest with a cotton sash. He undid the sash and pocketed a handful of copper change. Not a big haul, but Hakeswill was not dependent on his own plundering to fill his purse. He would take a cut from the soldiers that the light company found. They knew what they would have to pay up or else face punishment. He saw Sharpe kneeling beside a body and hurried across. Got a sword there, Sharpie? Stole it, did you? I killed the man, Sergeant. Sharpe looked up. Doesn't bleedin' matter, does it, lad? You ain't permitted to carry a sword. Officer's weapon a sword is. Mustn't go above your station, Sharpie. Get above yourself, boy, and you'll be cut down. So I'll take the blade, I will. Hakeswill half expected Sharpe to resist. But the private did nothing, as the sergeant picked up the silver-hilted blade. Worth a few bob, I dare say, he said appreciatively. Then he laid the sword's tip against the stock at Sharpe's neck. Which is more than you're worth, Sharpie. Too clever from your own good, you are. Sharpe edged away from the sword and stood up. I ain't got a quarrel with you, Sergeant. Oh, well, yep, Twitch network errors. I'll have to look into that. See. I ain't got a quarrel with you, Sergeant, he said. But you do, boy. Boy, you do. Hakeswill grimaced as his face went into spasm. And you know what the quarrel's about, don't you? Sharpe backed away from the sword. I ain't got a quarrel with you, he repeated stubbornly. I think our quarrel is called Miss Bickerstaff. Hakeswill said, and grinned when Sharpe said nothing. Almost got you with that flint, didn't I? Would have had you flogged raw, boy, and you'd have died of a fever within a week. A flogging does that in this climate. Wears a man down, a flogging does. But you got a friendly officer, don't you? Mr. Lawford. He likes you, does he? He prodded Sharpe's chest with the sword tip. Is that what it is? Officer's pet, are you? Mr. Lawford ain't nothing to me, Sharpe said. That's what you say, but your eyes tell different. Hakeswill giggled. Sweet on each other, are you? You and Mr. Lawford. Ain't that nice, Sharpie? But it don't make you much use to Miss Bickerstaff, does it? Reckon she'd be better off with a real man. She ain't your business. Ain't my business. Oh, listen to it. Hakeswill sneered and prodded the sword forward again. He wanted to provoke Sharpe into resisting, for then he could charge him with attacking a superior. But the tall young man just backed away from the blade. You listen, Sharpie, Hakeswill said, and you listen well. She's a sergeant's wife, not the whore of some common ranker like you. Sergeant Bickerstaff's dead, Sharpe protested. So she needs a man, Hakeswill said, and a sergeant's widow doesn't get rogered by a stinking bit of dirt like you. It ain't right, it ain't natural. It's beneath her station, Sharpie, and it can't be allowed. Says so in the scriptures. She can choose who she wants, Sharpe insisted. Choose, Sharpie, choose? Hakeswill laughed. Women don't choose, you soft bugger. Women get taken by the strongest. Says so in the scriptures. And if you stand in my way, Sharpie, he pushed the sword hard forward, then I'll have your spine laid open to the daylight. A lost flint? That would have been 200 lashes, lad, but next time, 1,000. And laid one hard, real hard. Be blood and bones, boy, bones and blood. And who will look after you? Miss Bickerstaff, then? Eh? Tell me that. So you take your filthy hands off her and leave her to me, Sharpie. He leered at Sharpe, but still the younger man refused to be provoked, and Hakeswill at last abandoned the attempt. Worth a few guineas, this sword, the sergeant said again as he backed away. Obliged to you, Sharpie. Sharpe swore uselessly at Hakeswill's back, then turned as a woman hailed him from among the heaped bodies that had been the leading ranks of the T-post column. Those bodies were now being dragged apart to be searched, and Mary Bickerstaff was helping the work along. He walked towards her, and, as ever, was struck by the beauty of the girl. She had black hair, a thin face, and dark, big eyes that could spark with mischief. Now, though, she looked worried. What did Hakeswill want? She asked. You. She spat, and crouched again to the body she was searching. He can't touch you, Richard. Not if you do your duty. The army's not like that, and you know it. You've just got to be clever, she insisted. She was a soldier's daughter who had grown up in the Calcutta barrack line. She had inherited her dark Indian beauty from her mother and learned the ways of soldiers from her father, who had been an engineer sergeant in the old fort's garrison before an outbreak of cholera had killed him, and his wife. Mary's father had always claimed she was pretty enough to marry an officer and so rise in the world, but no officer would marry a half-caste, at least no officer who cared about advancement. And so, after her parents' death, Mary had married Sergeant Jim Bickerstaff of the 33rd, a good man, but Bickerstaff had died of the fever shortly after the army had left Madras to climb to the Mysore Plateau, and Mary, at 22, was now an orphan and a widow. She was also wise to the army's ways. "If you made up to Sergeant Richard," she told Sharpe now, "then Hakeswill can't touch you." Sharpe laughed. "Me, a sergeant. That'll be the day, lass. I made corporal once, but that didn't last." "You can be a sergeant," she insisted, "and you should be a sergeant. Hakeswill couldn't touch you if you were." Sharpe shrugged. "Ain't me wants to touch, lass, but you." Mary had been cutting a tiger-striped tunic from a dead man, but she now paused and looked quizzically up at Sharpe. She had not been in love with Jim Bickerstaff, but she had recognized that the sergeant was a good, kind man. And she saw the same decency in Sharpe. It was not exactly the same decency, for Sharpe, she reckoned, had 10 times Jim Bickerstaff's fire and could be as cunning as a snake when it suited him. But Mary still trusted Sharpe. She was also attracted to him. There was something very striking about Sharpe's lean, good looks. Something dangerous, she acknowledged, but very exciting. She looked at him for a few seconds and then shrugged. "Maybe he won't dare touch me if we're married," she said. "I mean proper married, with the colonel's permission." "Married?" Sharpe said, flustered by the word. Mary stood. "It ain't easy being a widow in the army, Richard. Every man reckons your loot." I know it's hard," Sharpe said, frowning. He stared at her as he thought about the idea of getting married. Till now, he'd only been thinking of desertion. But maybe marriage was not such a bad idea. At least it would make it much harder for Hakeswill to get his hands on Mary's skin. And a married man, Sharpe reckoned, was more likely to be promoted. But what was the point of rising an inch or two in the dunghill? Even a sergeant was still at the bottom of the... Did he think he was gonna... Wait. Did he think he was gonna... Babe, the grammar, I can't understand what you're asking. Yeah, go ahead. It's fine. Take your time. Let's see. Where was did he think he was gonna get... Yeah. Basically, yes. He thought he was gonna... that's the thing. Hakeswill's a creep. That's the whole point. He thinks he can have whatever he wants because, well, he's a sergeant, and and everyone's afraid of him, so he can get whatever he wants. Let's see. Sharpe was more likely to be, even a sergeant was still at the bottom of the heap. It's better to be out of the army altogether, and Mary, Sharpe decided, would be more likely to desert with him if she was properly married to him. That thought made him nod slowly. "I reckon I might like to get married," he said shyly. "Me too." She smiled, and awkwardly, Sharpe smiled back. For a moment, neither had anything to say. Then Mary excitedly fished into the pocket of her apron to produce a jewel she had taken from a dead man. "Look what I found!" She handed Sharpe a red stone half the size of a hen's egg. "You reckon it's a ruby?" she asked eagerly. Sharpe tossed the stone up and down. "I reckon it's glass, lass," he said gently. "Just glass. But I'll get you a ruby for a wedding gift. Just you watch me." "I'll more than watch you, Dick Sharpe," she said happily, and put her arm in his. Sergeant Hakeswill, 100 paces away, watched them, and his face twitched. While on the edges of the killing place, where the looted and naked bodies lay scattered, the vultures came down, sidled forward, and began to tear at the dead. And I think that's a good stopping point. We've basically been introduced to our main character. We now know his current situation, and we also know that things are not looking good for Mr. Sharpe. Now, here's the thing. This book is pretty long. It's about, let's see. Yeah, about 300. It's 365 pages. So, hopefully we'll be able to do more next time. I got to get into the flow of doing this. I'm not exactly used to doing reading style stuff. Also, I think Twitch like crashed fully now. Still getting network. Okay, we're back now. What is going on? Hang on. I actually have to check now. Let's see. Okay, well, I'll have to look into it later. It says that it could be Twitch or it could be something else. Either way, that's going to do it for our reading stream tonight. We will be back. Don't worry. We'll definitely be back. But yeah, for now, I hope you all had a good time with it. I do want to, like I said, I do want to make this a more regular thing. As y'all can imagine, it'd be really cool to actually be able to, you know, do these reading streams because again, I want people to be calm and relaxed when I do them. But for now, we are going to go raid someone, and I know exactly who we're going to go raid. She's actually, I think, streaming right now. So I do want to go and surprise them. Whoops, not me. Let's move the chat back over here where it's supposed to be. There we go. But yes, that's going to do it for our first, or technically our second ever reading stream, but this was our first official one. Anyway, let's see. Let me go ahead and pull this up real quick. Give me a second.
Some weird, like,
We're going to go say hi to Mama Nile and Andrea. They are both doing Mech Warrior of all things, actually. So we're going to go say hi to them. Let's see. Which, once Fuga's over, we'll be getting back to Mech Warrior as well. All right, so that's going to do it for now. I hope everyone's having a great time, or had a great time here. It means a lot that you guys all showed up. I've been Zaruk Windcaller. As always, remember that the memories you make in life, good and bad, make you who you are, so never change them for anything. And for me personally, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to entertain you tonight. I hope, you enjoyed this. So, let's go say hi to Nile. See you all there.